Everyone, step back now. We need space.
She needs help. Get the paramedics.
It hurts so much. Sir, I said back up.
I'm helping her to the chair.
Thank you.
There are people in this world who mistake authority for cruelty, who wrap themselves in the thin paper of rules and regulations and believe it somehow transforms them into something powerful, something necessary, something righteous. Diane Holbrook was precisely that kind of person. I had known her for the 3 years my daughter Maya and I had lived on Crescent Hollow Drive. And in those 3 years, I had learned to read her the way you learn to read weather, the slight tightening around her eyes that meant a complaint was forming, the way she gripped her laminated HOA binder like a shield, the particular pitch of her voice when she was about to invoke Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the Crescent Hollow Community Standards and Expectations document, a 37-page manifesto. She had apparently authored herself and treated with the reverence most people reserve for scripture. Diane was 61 years old, recently retired from a career in municipal permitting, and she had channeled every ounce of the bureaucratic energy that career had given her directly into the 18 home cul-de-sac where we both lived. She was the HOA president, the HOA treasurer, and the unofficial HOA enforcement officer, a trifecta of neighborhood governance that she wore like a crown. Most of our neighbors had simply learned to avoid her. I had never quite managed that. Particular skill. My daughter Maya was 9 years old and had been diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy at 14 months. She used a power wheelchair for most of her mobility, though on good days, days when her energy was high and her muscles cooperated, she could manage short distances with her forearm crutches and sheer, breathtaking stubbornness. She had inherited that stubbornness from me, which I considered one of my finer contributions to her character. Maya was brilliant and funny and alarmingly perceptive. Not the kind of child who could read a room better than most adults and who had an encyclopedic knowledge of marine biology that she deployed in conversation with the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered the world's greatest secret. She also had a laugh that could make strangers turn around on the street. Not because it was loud, but because it was so genuinely delighted that it made you want to know what she'd found so wonderful. Raising her had been the greatest and most complicated privilege of my life. Raising her alone after her father left when she was 4, unable, he said, to handle the weight of it, as though Maya were a burden and not a person had made me harder in some ways and softer in others, and had taught me that the people most worth fighting for are exactly the ones the world is most comfortable overlooking. That November had been unusually cold in our part of Virginia, the kind of early winter that arrives before anyone is emotionally prepared for it, coating everything in a fine layer of ice that caught the morning light and looked almost beautiful until you actually had to navigate it. I had been fighting with the HOA for 6 weeks at that point about the accessibility ramp I'd installed along our front walkway. The previous summer, the ramp was necessary. Maya's wheelchair couldn't safely navigate the 2 steps that led from our front path to the street, and the original concrete had cracked badly enough that even her crutch days had become genuinely dangerous without it. I had hired a licensed contractor, pulled the correct permits from the county, and submitted what I believed was a thorough application to the HOA Architectural Review Committee, which was, of course, Diane. Diane had rejected it. The ramp, she informed me, in a letter that managed to be both formally worded and somehow personally insulting, was not compliant with Crescent Hollow's aesthetic guidelines, specifically the provision requiring all exterior modifications to maintain visual harmony with the existing architectural character of the community. The ramp was made of composite decking in a color called driftwood gray. It was, by any reasonable standard, perfectly nice, but Diane had decided that it disrupted the visual harmony of the cul-de-sac. And in Diane's world, visual harmony was apparently worth more than my daughter's ability to safely leave her own home. I had appealed the decision. I had written letters, citing the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I had CC'd the County Housing Authority and our state delegate's office. I had spoken to a disability rights attorney who told me, with the weary confidence of someone who had navigated this particular bureaucratic absurdity many times before, that we had an exceptionally strong case and that the HOA would almost certainly back down once they understood the legal exposure they were creating for themselves. I had shared all of this with Diane in a certified letter. Still, she had sent me 2 additional notices of violation, each one escalating in its formal language and its barely concealed satisfaction. This was the context: 6 weeks of correspondence, legal consultations, and growing fury in which Diane appeared on my porch on a Tuesday morning in November at 7:45. Just as I was helping Maya get ready for school, I heard the knock and knew. With the particular instinct you develop after 3 years of proximity to someone who delights in disruption, exactly who it was. Maya was in her chair at the bottom of the ramp, wrapped in her purple winter coat, her backpack covered in ocean animal patches. Watching me with those dark, perceptive eyes of hers, I told her I'd be 1 minute. I opened the door and there was Diane, clipboard in hand, breath misting in the cold air, wearing the expression of someone who has been looking forward to this moment. I want to be precise about what happened next, because the details matter, not just for the sake of the story, but because in the weeks and months that followed, those details would be recounted in legal depositions, in a formal complaint to the Virginia Fair Housing Board, in a local news segment that neither Diane nor I had anticipated, and in a conversation between my daughter and a journalist that Maya handled with more grace and clarity than most adults twice her age could have managed. So I want to be precise. I want you to understand exactly what Diane Holbrook did and exactly what happened as a result, because there is a particular kind of accountability that begins with simply telling the truth about a sequence of events. And Diane had been operating for a very long time in an environment where no one was paying close enough attention to hold her to one. Diane began speaking before had fully opened the door. That was characteristic of her. She operated with the brisk efficiency of someone who considered other people's time less valuable than her own, who could not quite bring herself to observe the basic social courtesy of waiting to be acknowledged. Before launching into her complaint, she said she was there regarding the unauthorized structure. She always called the ramp an unauthorized structure. Even after I had explained the permit situation multiple times and that she needed to inform me that the HOA board had voted at last Thursday's meeting to assess a daily fine of $50 until the structure was removed. I asked her who else had been at the board meeting, given that Diane was the board in every practical sense, and she told me that the meeting had been properly noticed in the community newsletter, which was a photocopied single page she left in everyone's mailbox approximately 4 times a year, and which most of my neighbors used to line their recycling bins. I told her I had received legal counsel indicating that removing the ramp would constitute a violation of federal disability law, and that the HOA was exposing itself to significant liability by pursuing this course of action. She told me that the HOA had its own legal resources. I told her that I genuinely doubted that. She told me this conversation was being documented, and this is the moment I want you to hold in your mind. While we were standing in my doorway having this exchange, while Diane was talking over me and I was trying to keep my voice level and measured and not say the things I actually wanted to say, Maya, waiting at the bottom of the ramp, decided to demonstrate her independence in the way 9-year-olds sometimes do when they are tired of being waited on and believe themselves entirely capable of handling a situation themselves. She decided to wheel herself back toward the house, back up the ramp, to come and stand beside me. It was something she did regularly. The ramp had been installed precisely to make it possible, but the ramp was icy that morning. I had not yet had the chance to apply the traction strips I used on particularly cold days, because I had not yet had the chance to finish getting Maya ready for school before Diane knocked. And the ice on the composite decking was thin and transparent, and not the kind of thing a 9-year-old thinks to check for before attempting a slope she has navigated 100 times before. Her chair's front wheels hit the icy patch. The chair stuttered, nay, in the way that physics and gravity and the particular cruelty of ordinary moments conspire against you. Pitched forward out of the chair and hit the concrete path below, the ramp with a sound that I cannot adequately describe to you, and that I will hear, I think, for the rest of my life. I was down the porch steps before I was aware of having moved. I was beside her before the sound had finished echoing. She was conscious. Maya was always so fiercely, stubbornly conscious, and she was crying, which I had learned over years of medical crises to interpret as a good sign, because crying meant breathing, and breathing meant she was with me. She was holding her left arm against her body in the particular way that told me, even before I could see anything clearly, that something was wrong with it. I was talking to her, telling her. I was there, telling her not to move, pulling out my phone with shaking hands. And behind me, I was dimly aware of Diane Holbrook standing on my porch steps, clipboard still in hand, saying something about how this was exactly why the ramp needed to be properly maintained, and that perhaps this incident illustrated the very safety concerns the HOA had been trying to address. I called 911, and then, because my hands were still shaking and my daughter was still crying and Diane was still talking, I said to her, very quietly, in a voice I did not raise because I did not need to raise it, that she needed to stop speaking, that she needed to get off my property, that I was going to remember every single word she had said this morning. And then I stopped listening to her entirely and focused on Maya, on keeping her calm, on telling her the ambulance was coming, on listening for the sound of sirens that I knew, in the particular desperate logic of a parent in a crisis, were the only thing that mattered in the world right now. They came in less than 4 minutes, counted every one of them. The emergency room at St. Catherine's Medical Center was the particular flavor of chaos that feels paradoxically deeply orderly once you have spent enough time in hospitals to understand its rhythms. Maya had been there before, not often, but enough that the nurses in the pediatric wing recognized us, which was a fact I had complicated feelings about. The way you have complicated feelings about anything that simultaneously represents care and the necessity of that care. The attending physician who saw Maya was a tall, unhurried woman named Dr. Okafor, who had the particular gift of speaking to pediatric patients as though they were full participants in their own medical care, which Maya responded to with immediate and visible relief. Dr. Okafor explained each step before she did it, asked Maya questions directly rather than rooting everything through me, and had a manner that was simultaneously professional and genuinely warm in a way that I associated with people who had chosen medicine not for its status, but for its purpose. I liked her immediately, with the uncomplicated gratitude you feel for competence when you desperately need it. The X-rays confirmed what I had suspected: fracture of the distal radius, the bone in the forearm just above the wrist, a clean break. That, Dr. Okafor said, was straightforward to treat, but would require a cast for 6 to 8 weeks, and careful monitoring given Maya's underlying condition. Spinal muscular atrophy affects muscle function throughout the body, and any injury that limited Maya's ability to use her arms, her primary means of independent movement and self-care, had implications that extended well beyond the fracture itself. Dr. Okafor was direct about this. She said that Maya's recovery would need to be coordinated with her SMA specialist, that her physical and occupational therapists would need to be involved, and that for the next several weeks, Maya's daily functioning and independence would be significantly compromised. She said all of this in a tone that was matter-of-fact without being cold, and she said it to both of us, including Maya in the explanation, with the natural ease of someone who understood that a 9-year-old had a right to understand what was happening to her own body. Maya, for her part, listened to all of this with extraordinary composure and then asked Dr. Okafor if she'd ever seen a mantis shrimp in person, because Maya had recently learned that mantis shrimp can punch with the force of a bullet, and she felt this was relevant to the conversation about bones. Dr. Okafor said she had not, but that she found the information genuinely impressive. Maya said she thought so too. I sat beside my daughter's hospital bed and felt the particular combination of pride and devastation that parenting a child like Maya routinely produces: pride at who she was, devastation at what the world kept doing to her. While Maya was being seen, I had called my sister Renee, who arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later with coffee for me and a stuffed otter for Maya, because Renee was the kind of person who maintained an emergency stuffed animal reserve for exactly these occasions. Renee was also the kind of person who, upon hearing the full account of the morning's events, became very quiet in the specific way that meant she was processing something that genuinely enraged her and choosing her words carefully before she spoke. When she finally spoke, she said 3 things. She said that what Diane had done was wrong. She said that I needed to call the attorney today, not tomorrow, today. And she said that this time we were not going to let it go. I had already been thinking all three of these things, but hearing Renee say them out loud made them feel less like reactions and more like a plan. I called the attorney from the hospital waiting room while Renee sat with Maya. His name was Gerald. Marsh and he had been the one who had told me we had a strong fair housing case 6 weeks earlier. When I told him what had happened, there was a pause on his line, the kind of pause that in a person of Gerald's particular professional composure communicated something significant. He said he needed me to tell him everything from the beginning, in order and to save every piece of documentation I had. I told him I had saved everything, all of Diane's letters. My responses, the permit paperwork, the contractor's records, photographs of the ramp before and after the ice, and a 6-week email trail that read, he would later tell me, like a textbook case study, in exactly the kind of housing discrimination that federal law was designed to prevent. He said he would file an emergency complaint with the Virginia Fair Housing Board, and would also be reviewing potential causes of action arising from the incident itself. He used the word incident in the careful, deliberate way attorneys use words they intend to use again in formal documents. And I understood that the morning had shifted something, had moved us from a dispute about a ramp to something with sharper edges and more serious consequences. What I did not know yet, sitting in that waiting room with bad coffee and shaking hands, was that several things had happened while I was in the ambulance with Maya that would significantly complicate Diane Holbrook's version of the morning. I would not learn about all of them until later, but they had happened. The world had been paying attention, even when neither Diane nor I knew it. Crescent Hollow Drive was the kind of street where people moved behind their windows like fish in a tank, observing the neighborhood's drama with the cautious interest of people who had opinions but had not yet decided whether those opinions were worth the social cost of expressing them. I had always assumed that my battle with Diane was watched with a kind of passive sympathy from the other 17 households on the cul-de-sac, that people felt it was unfortunate, that they thought Diane was being unreasonable, and that they had concluded this was ultimately not their problem. I had assumed this because it seemed consistent with the behavior I had observed, the polite waves and the carefully neutral expressions when Diane's name came up in conversation, the neighbors who had told me privately that they thought I was being treated unfairly, but who had not appeared at any of the HOA meetings I had attended to say so on the record. I was wrong about this. Or rather, I was wrong about some of them. It turned out that my next-door neighbor, 73-year-old retired electrical engineer named Harold Beaumont, has been watching from his kitchen window when Diane arrived at my door that morning. Harold had lived on Crescent Hollow Drive for 22 years and had, as he told my attorney with the measured precision of a man who had spent a career ensuring that things were recorded accurately, formed significant reservations about Diane Holbrook's fitness for her position over a period of years. He had documented several of these reservations because Harold was the kind of person who documented things as a matter of professional habit. He had also, on a whim he described as nothing more than getting fed up, set up a small security camera on his front porch the previous spring, pointed toward the street. After a dispute over a parking situation that he felt Diane had handled poorly, the camera had a wide enough angle to capture a significant portion of my front walkway. It had been running that morning. Harold had checked the footage after the ambulance left. He'd immediately called his son, who was a paralegal, and his son had told him to save everything and contact whoever was representing me. Harold had shown up at my door the evening after Maya's hospital visit with a USB drive, lasagna his wife had made, and the quiet, determined energy of a person who had decided that being a bystander was no longer acceptable. The footage was, as Gerald Marsh described it when he reviewed it the following morning, extremely useful. It showed Diane arriving at my door. It showed our conversation, inaudible, but clearly contentious based on body language. It showed Maya at the bottom of the ramp. It showed Maya's fall. It showed with the flat, unambiguous clarity of a camera that had no investment in anyone's narrative, Diane Holbrook standing on my porch steps with her clipboard while my daughter lay on the concrete, continuing to speak for a full 40 seconds before I had told her to leave. And then, And this was the detail that Gerald said would be particularly relevant, not leaving immediately, but remaining at the edge of my property, still holding her clipboard, watching the ambulance arrive, and only departing when one of the paramedics looked up and apparently said something to her. There was also, it emerged, a second witness, a woman named Patricia Osei, who lived 3 houses down and worked as a pediatric social worker, had been loading her car for work when she heard Maya fall. She had heard the impact and the subsequent crying and had started toward my house before she saw the ambulance had been called. She had also heard Diane's comment about the ramp needing to be properly maintained, because Patricia was close enough to the scene by that point that it had been audible to her. Patricia had stood in her driveway for a moment, processed what she had just witnessed, and then gone back inside and written it down. Time, date, what she had seen, what she had heard, word for word as best she could recall, with the instinct of someone whose profession had taught her that documentation is how people without institutional power protect themselves. She had also not known who to contact until Harold called around the neighborhood that evening. And then she had called me directly. And her voice on the phone was the voice of someone who was angry in the careful, deliberate way of people who would translate anger into action. Gerald filed the fair housing complaint 3 days after Maya's injury. He simultaneously sent a letter to the HOA to Diane specifically, in her capacity as president, notifying her that she was being named personally in a federal housing discrimination complaint, that the HOA's actions had been documented, and that the conduct during and following the incident on November 12th had been witnessed and recorded. He was careful about how he framed the letter because he was a careful attorney, but the substance of it was clear. The evidence was extensive. The legal exposure was serious. The path of least resistance, the only path, Gerald said, that made any rational sense for Diane and the HOA at this point was to resolve this quickly, completely, and on terms that addressed not just the ramp, but the broader pattern of conduct that the documentation revealed. Diane, he told me afterward, had apparently received the letter on a Friday afternoon. By Monday morning, Gerald had received a call from the HOA's insurance carrier. Meanwhile, something else had happened that none of us had engineered or anticipated. Patricia Osei, in a conversation with a colleague, had mentioned the situation. That colleague had a neighbor who worked in local news, and a woman named Stephanie Crane, a journalist at the regional CBS affiliate who covered housing and disability issues and who had, as it turned out, written about HOA-related fair housing violations twice before, had started making calls. The news segment aired on a Wednesday evening, 17 days after Maya broke her arm. I had known it was coming. Stephanie Crane had interviewed me the previous week. In my living room, with Maya's permission, and with Maya present for part of it. But there is a difference between knowing something is going to happen and being prepared for the specific texture of that happening. The segment was 4 minutes and 22 seconds long, which is substantial for local television news. It included footage of our ramp now cleared of ice and fitted with the non-slip strips I had installed the day after we came home from the hospital, footage of Maya navigating it in her wheelchair with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing this her whole life. The security camera footage from Harold's porch, which the station had obtained with his permission, and interviews with me, with Patricia Osei, Gerald Marsh speaking carefully about the legal proceedings, and with Maya herself, who sat in her wheelchair in our living room in a shirt that had a narwhal on it and answered Stephanie Crane's questions with the directness and composure of someone who had been waiting a long time to be asked. The station had reached out to Diane Holbrook for comment. She had declined to appear on camera. Her written statement, which Stephanie read in part during the segment, said that the HOA had always been committed to following applicable laws and that the matter was being reviewed by legal counsel. It was the statement of someone whose legal counsel had told her to say as little as possible, which was exactly what it sounded like, and which landed very differently than the confident certainty she had brought to my porch with her clipboard. 17 days earlier, I watched the segment at home with Maya, who was in her chair with her arm in a yellow cast. She had chosen yellow, and who watched herself on television with the expression of someone who finds the experience mildly surreal, but is determined to be collected about it. Interview portion aired when the camera showed her saying with absolute calm, that she just wanted to be able to go home safely. Like everyone else on her street, I had to look away for a moment. Maya noticed, because Maya notices everything, and she reached over with her good hand and patted my arm in the manner of someone who has had considerable practice comforting adults who are struggling to hold it together in her presence. I told her I was fine. She said she knew. She said she was fine too. She said there was a new documentary about deep-sea creatures she wanted to watch when the news was over. I told her that sounded exactly right. The HOA's insurance carrier reached a settlement with us 6 weeks after Gerald filed the complaint. The terms were confidential, but I can tell you that the ramp remains exactly where it is. It's in driftwood gray composite decking, fully permitted, non-slip strips in place. Permanent and legal and unremarkable feature of our home. The daily fines were rescinded, and the violation notices were formally withdrawn. The HOA also agreed, as a condition of the settlement, to adopt a written policy for processing accessibility accommodation requests. A policy that acknowledged the applicable federal and state laws, established clear timelines for decisions, and created an appeals process that did not root through a single person who was also the president, treasurer, and enforcement officer. Gerald said the policy was, in his opinion, what any reasonable HOA should have had in place from the beginning. He was not wrong. Diane Holbrook resigned from the HOA board 2 weeks after the news segment aired. I learned this from Harold, who delivered the information with the same quiet satisfaction with which he had delivered the USB drive, not gloating, exactly, but with the clear sense of a man who believed in cause and effect and found it genuinely gratifying when it functioned as intended. A new board was elected in January, consisting of 3 neighbors who held a meeting that lasted 45 minutes, addressed 3 actual agenda items, and concluded without incident. They emailed the community a summary afterward. It was 1 page long. No one laminated it. Maya's arm healed on schedule, slightly ahead of it actually, because Maya approached physical therapy with the same focused intensity she brought to everything she cared about, and because she had, as her SMA specialist observed at her follow-up appointment, kind of inner resource that doesn't show up on any diagnostic chart, but that was unmistakably there in the way she worked. She went back to school with her yellow cast, which her entire class signed, including her teacher, who wrote a small octopus drawing next to her name, because she knew that Maya would appreciate this. She told me on the drive home from the cast removal appointment that she'd been thinking about what happened and that she was glad people had done something about it. Because it wasn't fair, and she had known it wasn't fair even when she was lying on the concrete. She had known that in the way you know things that are simply true. I told her she was right. I told her it wasn't fair, and it should never have happened, and she deserved better, and so did every other kid who just needed to get in and out of their own house safely. She said yes, she agreed, and also she had been reading about how some species of octopus can solve puzzles. Did I know that? And I said I hadn't known that, but I was glad she'd told me, and we drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable, warm silence of 2 people who have been through something hard together and come out the other side of it still wholly and completely themselves. The ramp is still there. It will continue to be there. Some things, once you fight for them correctly and completely enough, simply stay.